everyone. Let's start this video on functions, and in this video we'll also see the different ways in which we can define functions in JavaScript. So let us get started with iDigitalPreneur. So a simple definition of functions would be when you want to write reusable pieces of code which can be executed with different values to yield different results. And this is helpful in modularity and the try principle. Now, what do I mean by this is that when you have a certain set of tasks or certain set of processes that you want to repeat with different sets of inputs to yield different sets of outputs, you wrap all of those functionalities inside a pair of functions, right? And then you execute the function with a different set of inputs. So for example, let us say that I want to write a function which adds two numbers and yields the results. So a non-functional way would be to define a variable. Let's say x is equal to 2 and then y is equal to 3, and then you are doing result is equal to x plus y, right? And then when you want to add in two different numbers altogether, so you will again create a variable which is x is equal, let a is equal to 21, let b is equal to 56, and let result 2 is equal to a plus b. So now you can see that things are getting a little bit more verbose because there is no limitation to the two numbers which you want to add in to get the result. Because whenever you want to add two numbers, you won't be creating separate variables and then storing that result inside of another variable and then using that inside of your code. Not only is this nonsensical in nature, but it also creates a lot of memory bottlenecks because you are stuffing your memory by creating variables which won't be used in the next iteration. That means you are flooding the memory with unnecessary variables. To kind of automate this process, we have the concept of functions, and functions are not just specific to JavaScript. Functions are available in every programming language of the world. Here we are only discussing functions in terms of JavaScript itself. So instead of writing all of these independent variables and adding them together and storing that inside of another variable, I can define a function. And to define a function, there are essentially three different ways with which you can define functions. We will discuss all of those three ways, but the most native way of defining a function is using the function keyword. So you write in function and then you name your function. So let's say I name my function sum2 numbers, and then you give a pair of brackets, and after this pair of brackets you define a pair of curly braces. So this curly braces, whatever code you write inside of this pair of curly braces will be the code which will automatically get executed with different sets of inputs, right? So let us say I will define a variable here, result is equal to a plus b. And what I want to do is I want to console.log the value of result. Now, this is a function which I have created. Now, where is this a and b coming in from? So a and b here are called parameters. So whenever your function expects some inputs, it is termed in terms of parameters. So this function has two parameters by the name of a and b. So these will be the inputs given into the function. The function will actually process it. So it will do a plus b and store it inside of a variable result. And then it will execute the next line and it will print a console.log of result. So I have created a function, what we call a function definition. And now I can use this function with different sets of inputs to get different sets of outputs. Now, if you run this, you will see that nothing gets printed because I have just defined the function. I haven't executed the function with any values inside of or any inputs inside of my function. So to execute a function, you simply write the name of the function, which is two numbers, and then give it a pair of brackets. And inside of these brackets, now you define the arguments. So we have parameters. Parameters are the labels or the namespace you give to the actual input. So this is the definition which expects a value of a, stored inside of A and a value stored inside of B. Now is the time to actually pass up those inputs. So I will say 2 comma 3. Now what ideally this will do is it will store the value of A to be 2 and it will store the value of B to be 3. And now once I execute the code, I will get a value of 5. I can change the value to anything else. So I can do 21 and 56, right? And I run this code and I will get a different output altogether. So this is one of the ways of defining a function, and you can already see that this has uh, created a scope for different n types of inputs to be given to my function. Now I can pass in any set of arguments to my function and get a different output altogether without repeating myself by declaring new variables and storing that result of their sum in a new variable. So this was the oldest way of defining a function. Historically, this was the only way with which we could define a function. The next way of defining a function is what we call a function expression. So this is a function definition. This is a function definition. And now we will see how we can define the same function but using a different technique called a function expression. A function expression simply means that I'm defining a variable. So let's say I define a variable by the name of sum two numbers, and this variable is equal to a function definition. And I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to paste it here. And this function takes in two parameters A and B. So these two variants of the function are the same owing to the fact that when I execute these sum two numbers and I give it 2 and 3, and let's comment this out. We just want to see how the function expression is working, and I will still get 5. So these two are the same function signatures, but they are different in terms of how they are defined. There are also some intricacies when it comes to function definitions and function expressions. I won't go into the details yet, but these are the two historical or the old ways of defining a function. Now, the same function can be written in another way, and this is called a arrow function. So to define an arrow function, you simply do const, or you can name it whatever the variable you want. It could be let or const or var. So I will say const and then sum two numbers, and this equals to an arrow function. So the way you define an arrow function is using the pair of brackets followed by a equal to greater than sign, which kind of resembles like an arrow, and then you give the function definition. Now inside of this function definition, I can copy all of the code which I want to be repeated, and now let's comment this out and execute the function, and still I will get the same result. So let's see what happened. Okay, so I did not define the parameters A and B, and now let's run this code and I will see that 5 is getting printed. So all of these three variants of my function are pretty much the same. It's just that there are some minute differences when it comes to the way these functions work and the way these functions have their return value. So we'll also see what the return value is, but essentially all these three are the same functions. Now in the modern JavaScript syntax, you will find a lot of arrow functions being used and a lot of normal native functions to be used. We generally differ from using function expressions owing to the fact that these functions don't hoist. I will discuss the topic of hoisting in a little bit right now. But essentially, you can use any of these three ways of defining a function in your JavaScript code. Now, let's see a couple of caveats of what happens in JavaScript. Suppose that I have this function. Let's come back to the original definition of the function. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to define, call this function, and instead of passing two variables, I am only going, or two arguments, I'm only going to pass one. So this function expected two arguments to be present, and I only passed in one argument. So if I run this code, if I run this code, I get a value of NaN, which is short form for not a number, because whenever I don't define the argument which I have defined a parameter for, because this function expected two arguments, but I'm only passing one. So the argument which I did not define, right, it is by default taken in as undefined. And when JavaScript executes the code, it basically tries to add up 2 plus undefined, which will give something which is not a number. And there is a data type in JavaScript, which we already saw in the first video of JavaScript, that there is a data type by the name of NaN, which is short for not a number. And that is what is printed to my console, which is NaN. If I pass the value again, now this will give me 47, owing to the fact that both of my arguments are getting passed. So this is one of the caveats which you always need to remember, that JavaScript will not give you an error if you don't pass in the total number of arguments which are there in the standard function definition, but it will take up all of those undefined arguments to be undefined and then try its level best to kind of come up with the answer. Now let's see the differences between the three different types of functions. So let us say instead of console.log, I'm returning the value of result, right? I'm returning the value of result. That means that if I execute this particular function, right, I won't get any output in the console because I am returning from the function itself. To kind of get the result, what I need to do is I need to define a sum, define a variable, and then store the return value of a function inside of a variable. And now I can go ahead and do a console.log of sum, and I will get the answer of whatever 2 plus 3 is, which is equal to 5. So this is the concept of return. Whenever the function is executing and it sees that there is a return statement with the return value, it comes outside. That means the execution of this function is stopped, and whatever value was returned from the function which came outside of the function, that is now ready to be served inside of a variable, or I can go ahead and use this value in a different context altogether. So the differences between these three functions comes with the point of return statements. So let's first of all discuss the difference between the normal function and the arrow function. So whenever we are returning something from a normal function, we always need to have a return statement. But let us say I refactor this code and now I simply say return A plus B. So this is a much more concise code. I'm not declaring a variable and I am just returning the value of A and B, like A plus B, and coming out of the function. If I do the same thing here, A plus B, and I remove this, and let's execute the code again, I am going to get the same result, which is 5. So this is a shorter way of returning an expression. If you are doing some simple computation in your function, you can simply return that expression. So after the return, you can write a JavaScript expression and it will compute that expression and return outside of the function with that value. Now with an arrow function, the advantage here is that I don't even need to write the return statement. If there is only one single line of code, I can write this function as A plus B. And if I write this and if I run this, so let's run the arrow function, I am going to get the same value, which is 5. So this is a much more shorter way of returning a value from the function. And this only works if you have only one line of code inside of your arrow function, which is returning a value. If you have more than one expression or more than one instructions inside of your function, then in that case, you need to define a curly braces and then you need to define the return keyword like this. This is the advantage of using an arrow functions over a normal function, that the amount of code that you're writing in comparison to a normal function and a function expression is way less in an arrow function. There is another difference between these three functions, and that is for the this keyword. We will not discuss about the this keyword because that is not important to discuss as of right now and well beyond the scope of our discussion. But just so you know that any way with which you define the function, that way is a feasible one. It should just essentially make sense to what you are trying to create. So these were the different ways with which you could define a function using arrow functions, function expressions, and function definitions. And you can use functions to kind of create highly reusable code or highly reusable pieces of logic, which you want to be repeated with different sets of inputs to get different sets of outputs. So that was all there is to functions. We will continue our discussion over basic JavaScript, and I will see you all in the further videos.